A reading from Psalm 33. Hear what God's Spirit is saying to you. Happy is the nation whose God is the Lord, the people whom he has chosen as his heritage. The Lord looks down from heaven. He sees all humankind. From where he sits enthroned, he watches all the inhabitants of the earth. He who fashions the hearts of them all and observes all their deeds. A king is not saved by his great army. A warrior is not delivered by his great strength. The war horse is a vain hope for victory, and by its great might it cannot save. Truly, the eye of the Lord is on those who fear him, on those who hope in his steadfast love. Our heart is glad in him because we trust in his holy name. Let your steadfast love, O Lord, be upon us, even as we hope in you. Here ends the reading of words that give us insight on God. May God grant us wisdom and courage for interpretation.
Last week, I did something called Question and Perspective, and you all asked questions, and I gave my perspective on something. And then after that, several folks still had questions, and they said, hey, could we do that again? And I said, no. But then I thought about it, and I thought, well, you know, we do have an extra Sunday here, and I am someone who likes to preach in series, and so I thought, hey, if I do this again, then it's a series. It's a two-part series. It's a question and perspective series. Also, if you're in one of the small groups and you're reading my devotional, right now the theme for the month is questions, exploring the questions. And so I think we'll do that again today. We'll do something different in the rest of August. But for today, we'll do part 2 of question and perspective. So go ahead and think about what questions you might have. In just a moment, I'll have Pastor Diego run around with the mic again this week like I did last week. And if you are watching online, primarily if you're watching on the University Christian Church Facebook page, because that's the one we're actively monitoring, and you have questions, you can put those in there as well, and Pastor Marcella will be looking at those. And just a reminder that oftentimes when we're thinking about the questions that we have, there is no one right answer. And so that's why I don't call this a Q&A, but instead a question and perspective. You ask a question, I'll offer you my perspective, and you can either think, oh, that's a good point, or, you got that wrong, Caleb, and either of those is fine. Okay, so what questions do we have? And let's try to prioritize, Diego, maybe folks who we didn't hear from last week so that more people get a chance to offer their questions.
Caleb, could you comment on suffering around the world?
Yeah.
I know people that don't believe in God because they ask, how could a loving God allow such suffering?
It's a great point, Scott. So this is one of the huge theological questions that people deal with. And in fact, it even has a fancy theological name called theodicy, which is the problem of evil. Right? And typically the way Christians have wrestled with this is, if we believe in a God who is all good and all powerful and all knowing, then why is there evil that exists in the world? Why is there suffering? And people have come up with all kinds of different responses to this. You know, some Christians say, well, it's because there's a cosmic good and a cosmic evil. There are sources of good and sources of evil, and that causes suffering in the world. Or sometimes people will say, well, actually, God allows this to happen. It's a part of God's plan. This is what God wants to happen. For me, those answers don't work. I think there are too many theological problems with that. I think whenever you're talking about like cosmic sources of evil, that's something that Christian theologians have dreamt up, but really isn't biblical. For instance, we've talked before about how the notion of hell isn't really a Christian notion, right? That that in the Hebrew Bible there wasn't a view even of the afterlife, let alone a place of eternal punishment. Whenever we read through the Hebrew Bible, what we mostly get is the word Sheol, which is just a dwelling for the dead. And whenever we read Jesus talk about what in English has been translated as hell, the word that he used was Gehenna, which was a literal place outside the walls of Jerusalem, where they either burned trash or it had been a place of child sacrifice. And it was thought to be the worst place on earth. And so Jesus used that as like a metaphor for what it's like to be separated from God. So the cosmic stuff doesn't work for me. And it also doesn't work for me to think that God causes people to suffering because the suffering that exists in our world seems to me to be beyond what a good God would allow. So instead, the way that I think about it is like this, that the universe has certain rules that govern the way that everything functions. I mean, we have the scientific laws that govern how the world works, right? That sometimes there are going to be hurricanes. Sometimes there are going to be tornadoes. Those are things not that God causes, but just exist in the universe. So I don't think that God is a part of that. There are also people who do some really evil things. Hitler, Netanyahu, Donald Trump. There are people who do really evil things in our world, and I don't think that God causes them to do that. Rather, for me, whenever I see God described in Scripture, what I constantly see is God described as a source of love and hope. And so for me, whenever I see suffering in the world, the place where I see God is in the love and the hope that exists in response to those things. And so Fred Rogers put this best probably in this quote that we probably all know, because Fred Rogers was a mainline Protestant Presbyterian USA minister. And so he said this, he said, when there's suffering, look for the helpers. There will always be helpers. And so for me, God is in the love and the response. So this is just my perspective on theodicy. Theodicy is something that we all have to make sense of in our lives and in the world. But for me, the world is the way it is. However, it is caused by our own actions and by the rules of the universe. But God is in the response. God is in the love. God is in the hope. And for me, that's the theology that works. Do we have another one, Diego?
Hey, Caleb. In light with what Pastor Marcella mentioned recently about attacking on women, I thought I would ask a question about Mary. And considering that there must have been something about Mary for her to be chosen.
Like the movie, something about Mary.
Right. Yeah. and just the first to receive the blood and body of Jesus, what your perspective about her role in terms of theology and how some churches see it?
Yep. Thanks, Paulo. So I think one of the things that is really fascinating to me about reading about Jesus is that Jesus was always a staunch advocate for women and for breaking down gender roles in his society. And we see this throughout his ministry. Jesus was always doing things that would have been socially unacceptable at the time. He was always doing things that made people uncomfortable, and he did those things intentionally to point out the injustice in that society around gender. Now, I don't think that you grow up to be that kind of person without being nurtured in that way. And so I think it is fair to say that Jesus' parents had to have had a fundamental role in shaping who he was and the values that he had. Mary is, of course, Jesus' mother. And in the Gospel of Matthew, we get Jesus' whole genealogy, and one of the things that I think is fascinating about that genealogy is that there are women in that genealogy. Maybe we talked about this last week, but that was an intentional choice from the author of the Gospel of Matthew to name women, because that's not typically what you did when you were going through and listing genealogy. And so Matthew specifically pointed out people in Jesus' genealogy who had done things that were controversial, like, say, Rahab, who was the prostitute who helped the Israelite spies, or like Tamar, who took her life into her own hands and was able to provide an heir. People who, like Ruth, who also had to take care of her mother-in-law, people who were doing things that in that society were seen as taboo. And they're listed as a part of Jesus' genealogy. Mary, too, I think, would have had some, I suppose, some pieces of herself that may have been taboo at the time. So I think it's fair to say that there was at least wonderment in ancient society about whether or not Joseph was Jesus' real father. And Mary would have been young, and there might have been some discussion about whether or not Joseph was really his father or not. So I'm not one who believes in like the virgin birth. I'm not one who believes in the Immaculate Conception. I think that the reason we get that is twofold. I think it is in part because there was a mistranslation into the version of the Hebrew Bible that Matthew and Luke had access to that mistranslated the Hebrew word for young woman into virgin. And so in an attempt to fulfill that prophecy, Matthew and Luke both use the word from the translation instead of the actual word, which is young woman. And I think the other reason that we get that is because in ancient society, saying that someone was born of a virgin was a literary way of saying that that person was going to be spectacular, was going to live an incredible life. And so you find this all over the place in ancient society. For instance, the Buddha is said to have been born of a virgin. And I probably have told you before about the story where an elephant enters the side of Buddha's mother and she's impregnated. Romulus and Remus were said to have been born of virgins. But I think primarily for Jesus, the most important thing to recognize is that Caesar, that the emperor, was said to have been born of a virgin. And so whenever Matthew and Luke, because we don't get birth narratives in Mark and John, whenever Matthew and Luke say that Jesus is born of a virgin, I think one of the things that they're doing is putting Jesus at odds with the Roman Empire from the very beginning of his life. It's also fair to say that Mary, like the rest of Jesus' female followers, never abandoned him and was with him throughout his life. So I think it's fair to say that, yeah, she was an incredible woman, and she definitely influenced the way that Jesus grew up and the way that he lived his ministry. Beyond that, I think from a historical perspective, I can't say much more. That we don't know much more about her other than that. So what you think of her beyond that, I think enters like the faith realm and what is meaningful to you.
Hi, this is not to do with the Bible, but if I want to become a pastor, is there any affirming colleges or universities, and can I take it online?
That's a good question. So I think one of the things that I love about University Christian Church is that there are a lot of people who get inspired and want to go into ministry, into ministry in the broader church, and I love that. And I think it's also important to say that like all of you already are ministers, right? You all are ministers. And there are a lot of disciples of Christ signs in particular that will, like church signs that will say, pastor is Reverend so-and-so, and it'll say ministers, the congregation. And so I think that's a reminder that we are all called to be in ministry out in the world. One thing that you may not know about the way that we typically prepare for ministry is that often there will be you will go through and do your bachelor's degree, and then you will frequently go and do a Master of Divinity degree at a seminary where you go through and you study all the things like Old Testament and New Testament and theology and preaching and pastoral care and all the things. And then you also have to, in addition to doing that academic work, you also have to meet with a committee of church folks who meet with you, make sure that your theology is developing in a way that's consistent with the denomination. And you go through this series of interviews, and then at the end of that, they say yay or nay for ordination. And then sometimes people then, of course, go beyond that. So I think that one of the things we're realizing in church is that path that I just described, the path that I took to ministry, which is going and doing a 4-year Bachelor of Arts degree and then going and doing a 3-year Master of Divinity degree, is not really the path for a lot of people in the future of the church. That we want to encourage people to enter ministry with recognizing the realities of how the world is working today. And so, for instance, both the Christian Church Disciples of Christ and the United Church of Christ have an alternative path to ministry in which experience and working in church life can be a path in which you can get ordained to ministry as well. And so both Pastor Diego and Pastor Marcella are in that process with the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. And we are also part of another denomination called the Progressive Christian Alliance, which recognizes that because of people's various life experiences, there may have been reasons that people did not go through that path that has been the typical path, the mainline Protestant ordination, and recognizes that. So that's all to say, it's a bit complicated. And if you feel called to ministry, let's sit down and talk about it, and we can help you discern what that call might be and what the right path for you might be.
Pastor Caleb, we have 2 questions online, and I want to honor our digital congregation as well. The first is from Susan Bottomley. She says, I know that God calls us to go out and share our faith, but in these times, I am often ashamed to be a Christian, and I am worried that if I share my faith, I will either come across a radical right person who will want to argue, or people will assume I am one of those judgmental Christians. How do we navigate this landscape?
That is such a significant question. I think in a lot of ways, it's the struggle that good, liberal, progressive Christian types like us have been dealing with for decades. And I think in large part it's because during the middle part of the last century, the reason this was called mainline Protestantism was because most people in the United States were mainline Protestants, right? But approach Scripture in the same way that we do, which is trying to accept what we know to be factual about modern science and about modern ways of reading the Bible, looking about how it was put together, looking at the socio-historical context and all of that. And the vast majority of Christians in the United States approached the Bible like that. And so for a long time, mainline Protestants thought, well, we don't need to address any of this other fringe stuff like fundamentalism because that's not what most Christians believe, right? But then they got a really loud voice, and it happened in part because of this pairing with the political right. And when that happened, all of a sudden, mainline Protestants didn't even know how to address that. And I think in part, too, that had to do with the fact that for a long time, all you had to do was put out a sign with a denomination in front of your church, and people would just show up. You know, they'd be like, oh, here's the local Presbyterian church. I'm going to go there. Or here's the local Baptist church or whatever. And that's not the way the world works anymore. And so many of us are extremely uncomfortable talking about our faith, in large part because we have not been trained to do that in any way. And I would say the best way to talk about your faith is simply to live it out. So what's that quote? Is it Francis of Assisi who said, preach your faith, when necessary, use words, right? Meaning that the primary way that we display our faith is by the way that we live our lives. That said, I think that if we live our lives out loud, if we embody our values, then it says a lot to people about what our faith means. I think right now in particular, though, it involves naming where people are just obviously being incredibly hypocritical, right? So like in the examples we've been given today about Christian nationalism, that naming Christian nationalism as heretical is important to do. To say that what these people are doing is incompatible with the teachings of Jesus, I think is important to do. I think saying these are my values and these other values are not is very important to do. And when you live your life like that, I think it helps people to know what kind of a person you are, and it helps people to learn about the Christian faith. So at least that's the approach that I've used. And if you have social media, use that as well. That's a great tool to help people know that a more authentic, I think, faith is possible.
So the other one is, this is a fun one. Question for Pastor Caleb. May I ask where you land on the spectrum of open theism, process theology, Arminianism, and Calvinism? I was taught in high school that only the Calvinist or Arminian theological views were biblical, and that open theism and process theology were sinful to believe in. As I have renegotiated my faith over the years, open theism and process theology make a lot more sense. And that is from Stephen Doyle, who watches us every week.
Wonderful. I love this. So just to talk about this in broad terms without getting into real specifics about the different types of theology, let me just give you general definitions here. So whenever we're talking about Calvinism, typically, and this church is a part of what we would call Reformed theology, so we do owe some debt to John Calvin for being here, because John Calvin is kind of the patron saint of Presbyterians, and the Christian Church Disciples of Christ in particular came from Presbyterians. That said, that's about the only relationship that this church has with Calvin's theology. And so John Calvin believed in like predestination, right? He believed that God had laid everything out, and we were just living into what God had already determined was going to happen. And so there are churches, especially in the Reformed tradition, that believe that we are living into God's plan and everything has already been planned out. Calvin also believed that meant that our salvation was predetermined as well. So I don't believe that. I don't think that there is a plan that has been laid out from the beginning of time to the end of history and that everyone's fate has already been determined. I don't believe that. I think that we have free will, and we have free will for a reason. Open theology, process theology have more to do with the fact or with the concept of God evolving and God's will becoming clearer over time. And so I'm much more interested in that. And as I said last week, the United Church of Christ has a way of articulating that, which is God is still speaking. And it's based on a quote, never place a period where God has placed a comma, right? That God is continuing to change and reveal what our world is going to be. So for me, thinking about God as being more open, more relational is something that resonates with me deeper than thinking that everything is already planned out. So broadly, I would say I'm much more in the camp of process and open theology. Maybe maybe one more question, and then we'll have to wrap it up.
I'm sure I don't know how to word this right. It's just been a frustrating um, uh, concern for me for months, a year, the last year, and I'm sure I would assume many people across our nation and the world. And I was hoping I came to this church because because of that, and I wanted to ask, or express the frustration that speaking to the Christian nationalism and so forth going on, and everybody, the different politicians saying, "Oh, we want to have a very Christian world." Why, for one, not that you can answer, is that nobody is, it seems, is speaking up. And for instance, this condition in Gaza, if we are supposed to have been 50%, 50-50 partnership with Israel in helping with the food distribution, which isn't going anywhere, why we don't take any responsibility for the maiming and the killing, the slaughter and murder and lack of distribution? And I wonder, it just perplexes me. And why you don't hear anybody speaking up about it? You don't see Trump. We already know he doesn't care, but that he takes vacation, he goes and addresses everything but that. And yet we have to have take credit for all of this. He's not taking any responsibility for that. And where is the Christian spirit in this country?
Yep, that's a good question. Yep. I think a couple of things here, and then this will be the last question. I want to be respectful of your time here, and you all know I'll just talk all day, and so I don't want to do that to you all. So I would say a couple of things. One, why have Christians been so silent on this? I think in broad strokes because of Christian Zionism, and that is because some Christians believe that in order for the end times to come, that Israel needs to be established to help bring about the end times. So that is not a biblical concept, and it also conflates the notions of ancient Israel versus a modern-day nation-state of Israel. And so that is not a helpful position, and it gives into this bad theological view that the world is going to end, which we know in this congregation from time after time talking about it, is not what was intended by, say, the book of Revelation, okay? So I think that why Christians have not condemned the violence happening there, I think in large part it's because of bad theology. That said, I do think that Christians are trying to condemn the violence in Gaza the best that they can. And I think that mainline denominations in particular have really been pushing condemnations, resolutions that condemn the state of Israel and, or at least Benjamin Netanyahu. And the World Council of Churches, just in the last couple of months, which represents millions of Christians all over the world, right? This is, the World Council of Churches, if you don't know, is the largest gathering body of Christians all around the world. So almost every Christian denomination is a part of the World Council of Churches. Okay, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, the United Church of Christ, both part of the World Council of Churches. But Orthodox churches, the Catholic Church is not a part of the World Council of Churches. It's kind of like an observer, but almost all churches are a part of the World Council of Churches. And the World Council of Churches, a couple of months ago, passed a resolution naming what is happening in Gaza as apartheid and genocide, and it called on member churches to do the same. And so, is that enough? No, it's not enough. It's not enough. And it is so frustrating to see so many people dying in the world and for a real lack of leadership to do anything about it other than to just watch it happen. That said, I think that our role, since none of us get to control foreign policy as much as we might like to, I think our role is to continue putting pressure on our representatives and our senators, on our politicians, to say that this is unacceptable. I think it is being vocal from a Christian standpoint. I think it is supporting aid organizations that are making an effort to help people who are suffering. And I think that we also have an obligation at a local level, because that's something that we do have control over, to make sure that we're not generalizing about groups of people and to build relationships across interfaith lines. Because one of the real unfortunate things that have happened since October 7th is that interfaith relationships have fallen apart at local levels. And this is something that has happened all across the world, but has certainly happened in San Diego. And you all know that from things that have been in the news. And so we can't control what's happening in Gaza as much as we would like to, but what we can do is work to build relationships across interfaith lines here and try to see each other as full human beings. So I wish I had an answer to the global situation. I don't have that answer. I wish anybody had the answer to solve the issues in Gaza, but unfortunately, we're not seeing that now. All we can do is the best we can do, and to continue to hope and pray and work together.